The trembling voice of co-pilot David Wilson echoed through the Boeing 747's intercom system as the aircraft battled through one of the worst storms ever recorded over the North Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical emergency. Captain Harrison is unconscious and I need immediate assistance from anyone with combat aviation experience. In row 23C, Colonel Aria Washington slowly opened her eyes. At 34, she had learned to sleep anywhere during her military career, but something in the desperation of that voice made her sit up instantly. Beside his wife in first class, businessman Marcus Thompson adjusted his expensive glasses and muttered loud enough for others to hear, as if anyone truly qualified would be traveling in economy class. His disdainful gaze swept over Aria, who wore simple jeans and a basic sweater, her natural hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Violent turbulence shook the plane like a toy, throwing passengers against their seats as rain hammered the windows with deafening force. Among the 312 passengers, panic was beginning to set in. Children cried, people prayed aloud, and some were already typing farewell messages on their phones. Marcus stood up abruptly, his arrogance intact even in the face of chaos. "Listen here, kid," he yelled toward the cockpit. "I've flown in private jets across 3 continents. I have over 200 hours as a passenger in luxury aircraft. I can help more than anyone else on this plane." Aria stood quietly, her movements fluid and precise, unlike the desperate agitation of other passengers. As she walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, Marcus watched with obvious skepticism. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Colonel Aria Washington, Air Force, 500 hours flight time in F-22 Raptors, expert in navigation under extreme conditions." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Thompson stared at her in utter disbelief, his mouth open in shock. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, I respect our military, but I'm not going to bet my life on some fantasy. My wife and I paid a fortune for these first-class seats, precisely to avoid situations like this." Other passengers began to murmur among themselves. An elderly lady in first class whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Is she really qualified? She looks so young and well." The subtext was clear and painful. David Wilson appeared at the cabin door, his face pale with terror. "Please, anyone with military experience needs to come forward now. Captain Harrison is having seizures. And I've never flown solo in conditions like this." His voice broke on the last words, revealing the depth of his fear and inexperience. But what Marcus didn't know about the quiet woman in 23C would change everything. As the storm raged outside, Aria Washington carried with her not only exceptional flying skills, but also a personal history of breaking barriers and defying expectations at every turn of her remarkable military career. If you believe that no one should ever face discrimination based on their appearance while trying to save lives, type courage below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against prejudice worldwide. Your participation shows that true leadership knows no boundaries. Marcus Thompson's bitter laughter echoed through the cabin as the storm continued to batter the Boeing 747 with unprecedented fury. "Colonel," he gestured dismissively toward Aria, "look, I respect our military, but I'm not going to bet my life on someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class. There are protocols for a reason." The businessman's wife, Victoria, shifted uncomfortably in her leather seat, finally breaking her silence. "Richard, maybe we should listen to her. She seems to know what she's talking about." But Marcus waved her off with the same arrogance that had made him millions in real estate deals, where intimidation often trumped competence. "Listen here, young lady." Marcus stood up again, puffing out his chest in a display of manufactured authority. "I've flown in private jets all over Europe and Asia. I have over 200 hours of experience as a passenger in luxury aircraft. I know all the procedures because I pay attention to details that matter." Aria remained silent for a moment, observing the dynamics with the calculated patience of someone who had learned during years of military service that certain battles had to be chosen carefully. She had faced this type of challenge countless times. Men who confused wealth with wisdom, privilege with competence. Around them, other passengers were beginning to take sides. Some first-class passengers nodded in agreement with Marcus, their expensive clothes and jewelry somehow validating their opinions in their own minds. Economy passengers watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism, wondering if the quiet woman could really save them all. "Mr. Wilson," Arya said calmly, ignoring Marcus entirely, "I need to know our current altitude, speed, and exact weather conditions." Her voice carried an unmistakable note of authority that made the young co-pilot respond automatically. "We're at 38, EUO 0 feet, speed 450 knots, crosswinds of 120 kilometers per hour with gusts up to 160, David replied, recognizing something in her tone that Marcus had completely missed. There was a quality of command that couldn't be faked or bought. Marcus let out a cruel laugh that made several passengers wince. "Impressive! She memorized some numbers from Wikipedia. That doesn't make her a pilot, and it certainly doesn't qualify her to risk all our lives playing aviation hero." It was then that Arya did something that silenced the entire cabin. Without hesitation, she began to recite with mechanical precision, "Emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude. Immediate oxygen mask deployment. Emergency descent to 10, EUO 0 feet. Descent angle not exceeding 15 degrees to avoid structural stress. Communication with air traffic control using transponder code 7700, followed by emergency frequency 121, 5 megahertz. She continued for another full minute, detailing procedures for engine failure, hydraulic system malfunction, and navigation equipment failure that only highly trained military pilots would know by heart. The technical specifications flowed from her lips like a practiced symphony, each detail precise and delivered with the confidence of someone who had not only studied these procedures, but had executed them under life-and-death conditions. The ensuing silence was broken only by the continuous roar of the storm outside. David Wilson stared at her with a mixture of relief and growing admiration, finally understanding that he might actually have found salvation in the most unexpected place. Dr. Patricia Martinez, a neurosurgeon who had been quietly observing from her business-class seat, stood up slowly. "I'm Dr. Martinez, Chief of Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. I've worked with military pilots for 15 years treating combat injuries." She looked directly at Marcus. "That level of technical knowledge isn't something you learn from passenger manuals, Mr. Thompson." But Marcus wasn't finished with his display of ignorance and prejudice. His face reddened with the frustration of someone unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by people he considered beneath his social station. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm Arya was about to unleash on Marcus Thompson's carefully constructed world of assumptions and privileges. "Wait just 1 minute," Marcus declared, his voice rising above the howling wind outside. "Anyone can memorize procedures from a manual. I demand to see proper credentials before I entrust my life to someone who clearly does not belong in first class on an international flight." The words cut through the air like blades, sharp with implications that made several passengers avoid eye contact. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence as Marcus's challenge hung in the air, embodying every prejudice and assumption that Arya had faced throughout her groundbreaking military career. Arya felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same sensation she had experienced countless times when she had to prove her competence twice as much as any male or white colleague. For a moment, memories flooded her mind like scenes from a painful documentary of discrimination. She remembered the first time she was questioned during a combat mission, when a white colonel publicly doubted her ability to lead a fighter formation over hostile territory. She remembered being passed over for a promotion despite having the best flight record in her class, while less qualified male pilots advanced ahead of her. She remembered the whispered comments about diversity quotas that had followed her throughout her career like shadows of doubt. But she also remembered what had made her the most decorated pilot of her generation, the ability to turn every doubt into fuel, every insult into motivation, every underestimation into a strategic advantage that her detractors never saw coming. David Wilson appeared again at the cabin door, his desperation now palpable. "Ma'am, please. The captain is getting worse, and I honestly don't know how much longer I can handle this alone." These weather conditions are beyond anything they taught us in commercial flight school. Mr. Thompson, Arya said finally, her voice loaded with a calm that made some passengers shiver with recognition of barely controlled power. There are three kinds of pilots in this world: those who fly when it's easy, those who fly when it's hard, and those who fly when it's impossible. She took a deliberate step toward the cockpit, then paused, turning back to face Marcus, with eyes that held depths of experience he couldn't even begin to fathom. During my career, I have saved 17 aircraft in situations that the manual said were unrecoverable. I've landed jets with no engines, no hydraulics, and no navigation systems in conditions that would ground every aircraft in civilian aviation. The plane dove violently at that moment, as if the storm itself was punctuating her words. Several passengers screamed as they were thrown against their restraints, but Arya didn't even brace herself. She maintained her balance with the practiced ease of someone who had faced turbulence far worse than anything atmospheric storms could produce. "But what really qualifies me for this moment," she continued, her voice steady as a rock while chaos reigned around her, "isn't my medals or my flight hours or my technical knowledge. What qualifies me is that I am the only person on this plane who has ever flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a destroyed navigation system, and surface-to-air missiles being fired at my aircraft." Her words carried the weight of lived experience that couldn't be questioned or diminished by prejudice. "And I still brought my entire squadron home alive, every single pilot under my command." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in decades, he found himself facing someone whose accomplishments so far exceeded his own that his usual tactics of intimidation and class privilege seemed not just inadequate, but pathetically small. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly from her seat. "Colonel Washington, I've treated dozens of combat pilots with injuries sustained during impossible missions. What you're describing requires skills that no amount of money can buy, and no civilian training can provide." Around the cabin, passengers were beginning to reassess their initial assumptions. The quiet woman in economy wasn't just another passenger trying to help. She was quite possibly their only chance of survival in conditions that were rapidly deteriorating beyond the capabilities of commercial aviation. Arya began walking toward the cockpit, with the measured stride of someone who had made this walk many times before, always toward danger, always toward the impossible, always toward situations where other people's lives depended entirely on her competence under pressure. "Mr. Thompson," she said without turning around, "when we land safely, and we will land safely, perhaps you'll reflect on how a black woman who doesn't belong in first class saved your life and the lives of everyone you claim to care about." As she disappeared into the cockpit, the passengers fell silent, many beginning to realize that they might be witnessing something far more significant than a simple emergency landing. Marcus was about to learn why they call her Spectre. Inside the cockpit, Arya Washington was faced with a situation that would have sent any commercial pilot into complete psychological collapse. Captain Harrison was convulsing violently in his seat, foam emerging from his mouth as heart monitors blared deafening alarms that competed with the storm's fury. David Wilson was literally paralyzed with terror, his hands shaking uncontrollably over controls he could no longer operate effectively. Sweat poured down his face as he stared at instruments that showed conditions far beyond his training or experience. "First aid now," Arya ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos like a surgical instrument. She moved to check the captain's vital signs with the precision of someone who had treated wounded pilots in active combat zones, her fingers finding pulse points and checking responses with medical knowledge that surprised even her. "Colonel, how do you know so much about emergency medicine?" David asked, watching her work with growing amazement as she stabilized the captain's condition while simultaneously scanning the flight instruments. 10 years flying rescue missions in hostile territory," she replied matter-of-factly, adjusting navigation instruments while continuing to monitor the captain's vital signs. "When you're the only person standing between a wounded soldier and death, you learn more than just flying. You learn everything that keeps people alive." Her hands moved over the controls with an almost supernatural fluidity, as if the aircraft was an extension of her own body rather than a machine requiring conscious manipulation. Every adjustment was precise, economical, and executed with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times under far worse conditions. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, Marcus Thompson had convinced half of first class that they were all doomed because of what he called an imposter at the controls. His voice carried throughout the cabin as he held court with his fellow premium passengers. "Did you see how she was dressed?" he muttered to anyone willing to listen, his prejudice now operating in full display mode. "Qualified people don't travel in economy wearing discount store clothing. I guarantee she doesn't even have a valid pilot's license. This is some kind of elaborate scam or delusion." Victoria Thompson, who had remained diplomatically silent until this point, finally confronted her husband directly. "Marcus, stop it. You're being completely ridiculous, and frankly, you're embarrassing yourself." "Ridiculous?" Marcus turned to her with indignation that bordered on fury. "I'm trying to save our lives here. I'm not going to leave our safety and the safety of our children's inheritance in the hands of someone who clearly doesn't belong in any cockpit, much less one carrying people of our social standing." His words were interrupted by the sound of Arya's voice over the intercom, now speaking with the unmistakable authority of someone who had assumed full command of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Washington speaking from the cockpit. I am now in full command of this aircraft until we reach our destination. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the flight crew without question or delay." The authority in her voice was unmistakable and undeniable. It wasn't the tone of someone trying to convince or impress others, but rather the natural command presence of someone who was completely accustomed to being obeyed without question in life-and-death situations. Even Marcus felt an involuntary chill run down his spine as he heard that voice. There was something in it that transcended his prejudices and spoke directly to a primal recognition of competence and leadership that couldn't be faked or purchased. In the cockpit, Arya had already begun the complex process of transforming David Wilson from a paralyzed co-pilot into an efficient assistant capable of supporting her during the most challenging flying conditions either of them had ever encountered. "David, I need you to monitor our fuel consumption and pressurization systems continuously," she instructed, while making calculations that seemed to defy conventional wisdom. "Give me accurate readings every 30 seconds. I'm going to get us out of this storm, but I need precise information to execute maneuvers that aren't in any civilian manual." "Yes, ma'am," David replied, his confidence returning for the first time since the emergency began. There was something about Arya's presence that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, they could actually survive this impossible situation. Then she did something that left David completely perplexed and slightly terrified. Instead of following standard emergency routing procedures, Arya began mentally calculating a flight trajectory that seemed to violate every safety protocol he had ever learned, planning to fly directly through the heart of the storm system rather than attempting to navigate around it. What happened next would haunt Marcus Thompson for the rest of his life, as he was about to discover the true meaning of competence under pressure. "Colonel, with all due respect, this goes against every safety protocol we've ever been taught," David protested, watching the calculations that Arya scribbled on a notepad with handwriting that looked more like advanced mathematics than flight planning. The trajectory she was plotting seemed not just unconventional, but actively dangerous. A path that would take them deeper into the storm system rather than seeking the safe route around it that every commercial pilot would instinctively choose. Arya smiled for the first time since taking command, an expression that held secrets and experiences that David couldn't even begin to imagine. "David, let me tell you something about impossible situations. In 2018, I was leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan when our squadron was hit by surface-to-air missiles. 2 engines failed completely, our navigation system was destroyed by shrapnel, and a massive sandstorm reduced visibility to absolute zero." She continued flying as she spoke, her hands moving over the controls with mesmerizing fluidity that made complex adjustments look effortless. The manual said to eject immediately and abandon the mission. Standard protocol demanded that we save ourselves and leave 17 wounded soldiers to die on that mountainside. Her words carried a weight that made David understand he was in the presence of someone truly exceptional. someone who had faced impossible choices and found ways to transcend the limitations that stopped ordinary people. "So I did exactly what I'm doing right now," she continued, executing a banking maneuver that shouldn't have been possible in a commercial aircraft. "I threw the manual out the window and trusted 17 years of experience flying through situations that don't exist in any textbook." David watched in fascination as she made adjustments that seemed to anticipate the storm's movements rather than simply reacting to them. "What happened to the soldiers?" "I brought them all home," she said simply. "All 17 of them, not one casualty." The quiet pride in her voice was unmistakable, the satisfaction of someone who had chosen courage over protocol and saved lives because of that choice. Sometimes, David, following the rules kills people. Knowing the rules well enough to break them at exactly the right moment, that's what separates mediocre pilots from pilots who save lives when everyone else has given up. At that moment, the cockpit door burst open. Marcus Thompson had managed to convince a flight attendant to let him through, claiming he had relevant aviation experience that needed to be evaluated immediately by someone with proper judgment. "This is utter madness," he declared upon seeing Aria's unconventional calculations and flight path. "You're putting us all in mortal danger with these reckless experiments. I demand to speak to air traffic control immediately. This woman is going to kill us all with her amateur theatrics." Aria didn't even turn to acknowledge his presence, her concentration entirely focused on the life and death decisions that required her complete attention. "Mr. Thompson, this cockpit is no place for tourists. Please return to your seat immediately and let trained professionals handle this emergency." "Tourist?" Marcus's voice rose to a higher pitch, his indignation reaching new heights. "I've flown in more private jets than you've probably seen in your entire life. I know aviation, and what you're doing here is nothing short of collective suicide, disguised as heroism. That's when something interesting happened that would change the entire dynamic of the situation." Dr. Patricia Martinez, who had been quietly observing the conflict between Marcus and Aria, finally decided to make her professional opinion known to everyone in the cabin. She stood up from her business class seat and walked purposefully toward the cockpit, her medical credentials and years of experience working with military personnel giving her insights that Marcus completely lacked. "Colonel Washington," she said calmly, "I'm Dr. Martinez, Chief of Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I worked for 3 years in military hospitals, treating pilots with neurological injuries sustained during combat missions. I can help with Captain Harrison's condition." Aria finally turned around, and the two professionals recognized each other instantly, not personally, but as people who had dedicated their entire careers to saving others under extreme conditions. There was an immediate mutual respect that transcended rank, race, or any other superficial considerations. "Doctor, it would be an honor to have your assistance," Aria replied. "The captain is stable for now, but we need continuous monitoring of his neurological status. What I'm about to attempt will subject everyone on this aircraft to G-forces that could affect his condition." Marcus watched this exchange with growing frustration, finally beginning to understand that he was witnessing a level of professional competence and mutual recognition that his money and social status could never purchase or understand. The military frequency was about to reveal a truth that would silence everyone on the aircraft, including Marcus Thompson. "Doctor." Martinez looked at Marcus with the patient expression of someone who had spent years dealing with hysterical family members during medical crises. "Mr. Thompson, I've treated hundreds of military pilots over the past 15 years. This woman has the kind of training and experience that no amount of money can buy, and no civilian education can provide. I suggest you trust her professional judgment," she continued, "because I can guarantee you that her qualifications are far beyond anything you've encountered in your business dealings or private jet experiences." Marcus laughed bitterly, his frustration now reaching a boiling point. "Trust? Based on what? Her word? Some military fantasy? I'm supposed to bet my life and my wife's life on someone who can't even afford first-class tickets?" It was then that Aria made a decision that would completely change the dynamics of the entire situation. Without stopping her flying duties for even a moment, she calmly reached for the radio communications system. David, please tune to Military Emergency Frequency 121. 5 and establish contact with Andrews Air Force Base, she instructed, while simultaneously making course corrections that kept them stable in conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. Colonel Washington to Andrews Base, requesting identity confirmation for civilian emergency assistance. She spoke into the radio with the crisp professionalism of someone who had made thousands of similar communications during her military career. The response came immediately, crackling through the cockpit speakers with crystal clarity. Colonel Washington, Spectre, is that really you? This is Commander Rodriguez at Military Air Traffic Control. We confirm your identity immediately. David's eyes widened as he heard the radio conversation, finally understanding that he was working alongside someone whose reputation extended far beyond anything he had imagined. The call sign Spectre carried weight in military aviation circles that civilian pilots could barely comprehend. Spectre, you disappeared from our radar systems 20 minutes ago, Commander Rodriguez continued. The entire Air Force Emergency Response Network has been mobilized looking for you. We have rescue operations standing by across 3 time zones. The cabin fell completely silent as passengers heard this exchange over the intercom system. Marcus Thompson turned pale, his face draining of color as he began to realize that he had completely and utterly misjudged one of the most decorated pilots in American military history. His assumptions, his prejudices, his social snobbery, all of it was crumbling as he heard official military confirmation of exactly who was now flying their aircraft through impossible conditions. Andrews Air Force Base, Aria continued, her voice maintaining perfect professional composure. We have a simultaneous medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated due to medical crisis, flying through an unforeseeable storm system with conditions exceeding all civilian aircraft capabilities. Requesting coordinates for emergency landing at the nearest airport with full Boeing 747 capability and complete medical facilities standing by, she added, while making flight adjustments that demonstrated her complete mastery of the aircraft. Spectre, you have absolute top priority, came the immediate response. All airspace on the entire eastern seaboard has been cleared exclusively for your emergency. We have medical emergency equipment and personnel being directed to Baltimore International Airport as we speak. Dr. Martinez smiled discreetly when she observed Marcus's expression of dawning horror and humiliation. Tell me, Mr. Thompson, do you know many tourists who have the entire United States Air Force mobilizing emergency resources to assist them? But Marcus was beyond responding. He was staring at Aria with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing in real time, someone who had built his identity on assumptions that were proving not just wrong, but catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. Victoria Thompson looked at her husband with disgust and disappointment. Marcus, you've just spent the last 30 minutes insulting and dismissing someone who is quite literally our only chance of survival. Someone whose qualifications are so far above yours that it's embarrassing to even make comparisons. Around the cabin, other passengers were having their own moments of realization. The quiet woman in economy class wasn't just another passenger trying to help in an emergency. She was a living legend of American military aviation, someone whose skills and experience were being recognized at the highest levels of military command. What none of them knew yet was that this emergency was just the beginning. In the next few minutes, Harrier Washington would have to use not only her elite piloting skills, but also classified knowledge acquired during secret missions that even her military superiors didn't fully understand. Aria's next words would expose 17 years of hidden heroism that would forever change how everyone on that aircraft understood courage, competence, and the true meaning of service above self. Andrews Base to Spectre, we have critical information that changes everything. Commander Rodriguez's voice echoed through the cockpit with increased urgency. The weather system you're encountering is intensifying beyond all meteorological predictions. Wind speeds now reaching 180 kilometers per hour, with hail the size of baseballs. The reality of their situation hit everyone in the cabin like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with another commercial flight experiencing technical difficulties. They were literally flying through a meteorological apocalypse that had forced the closure of all civilian airspace across the eastern United States. All airports in the region are closing their runways due to impossible landing conditions, Rodriguez continued. You are currently the only civilian aircraft still airborne in American airspace. Every other flight has been grounded or diverted to emergency locations hundreds of miles away. David Wilson felt his knees buckle as he fully understood the scope of their crisis. Colonel, we're completely alone up here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David, I need you to monitor our vertical speed indicators very carefully, Arya replied calmly, beginning to perform mental calculations that seemed to defy the laws of physics as applied to commercial aviation. We're going to execute a maneuver that has never been attempted in a Boeing 747. Her hands moved over the controls with a precision that made it appear as if the massive aircraft was responding to her thoughts rather than mechanical inputs. Every adjustment was deliberate, purposeful, and executed with the confidence of someone who understood aerodynamic principles at a level that transcended normal pilot training. Colonel, what exactly are we going to do? David asked, watching instrument readings that suggested maneuvers impossible for a commercial aircraft of this size and weight classification. Controlled spiral descent through the eye of the storm, she replied, beginning calculations that left both David and Dr. Martinez completely amazed at the complexity of her mental mathematics. It's a technique developed for military fighter jets that has never been attempted in a civilian aircraft of this mass and configuration. Marcus Thompson felt his legs giving way beneath him as he finally began to comprehend the true scale of Arya's expertise. During his entire business career, he had met some genuinely exceptional people, but never anyone operating at such an advanced level of technical competence that their abilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Spectre, this is General Patricia Hayes from Pentagon Air Operations Command, another voice interrupted over the radio. We have confirmed reports of your previous missions. Is it true that during Operation Tempest Shield in 2019, you successfully guided 2 other malfunctioning aircraft to safety using only radio communications? Affirmative, General, Arya replied, while simultaneously adjusting flight angles that made the Boeing 747 dance through air currents that should have torn any aircraft apart. Similar atmospheric conditions, different variables. One C-130 with complete navigation failure. One fighter jet with dual engine problems. David stared at her in absolute amazement. Colonel, you saved other aircraft just by giving instructions over the radio, without being physically at their controls? 17 aircraft throughout my military career, she confirmed, her concentration completely unshaken by the conversation, while performing maneuvers that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of commercial aviation. When you learn to see atmospheric patterns in 3 dimensions, you can guide anything that flies, regardless of whether you're physically present at the controls. It was at this precise moment that Marcus Thompson experienced a devastating epiphany about the true extent of his ignorance and prejudice. The woman he had judged incapable based purely on her appearance and social class wasn't just a competent pilot. She was a living legend of military aviation whose skills were studied and respected by military academies around the world. General Hayes, Arya continued over the radio while executing impossible flight corrections, requesting confirmation that all civilian aircraft have been directed to alternate airports with safe landing capabilities. I don't want anyone attempting to follow our flight trajectory or emergency procedures. Spectre, you are the only thing flying in American airspace right now, General Hayes confirmed. We have 13 military bases actively monitoring your situation, and the President of the United States has been personally briefed on your emergency status. Marcus felt the world spinning around him as he processed this information. The President of the United States was being personally informed about the flight he was traveling on. Piloted by a woman he had attempted to disqualify based on racial prejudice and class assumptions. The Pentagon was mobilizing resources for someone Marcus had dismissed as unqualified to handle an emergency situation that was now being recognized as a crisis of national significance. What Arya did next would prove why she's called the best pilot in military history. As she prepared to execute maneuvers that would redefine the possibilities of commercial aviation forever. David, I need you to take over all communications with air traffic control while I execute the descent, Arya instructed with the calm authority of someone who had performed similar coordinations during combat missions. I'm going to need total concentration for the next series of maneuvers. The complexity of what she was attempting became clear as she began explaining her strategy to David while simultaneously preparing the aircraft for procedures that existed nowhere in commercial aviation manuals. "Colonel Washington," Marcus finally spoke, his voice broken with humiliation and the crushing weight of his own ignorance. I need to apologize for everything I said. What I did was completely inexcusable, and I understand now that I was wrong about everything." "Mr. Thompson," Arya interrupted him without diverting any attention from the life and death decisions that required her complete focus. "Your apologies can wait until after I save your life and the lives of everyone else on board this aircraft. Right now, that's the only thing that matters." The aircraft began a controlled spiral descent that defied every law of commercial aeronautical physics that David had ever studied. Arya had located a descending air column in the center of the storm system, a relatively stable atmospheric tunnel that would allow them to descend below the layer of severe turbulence that was making normal flight impossible. "My God," David murmured, watching instruments that showed descent rates and flight angles that shouldn't have been sustainable in a Boeing 747. "How did you even know that air current existed?" "It's not showing up on any of our weather detection systems. 10 years flying through hostile weather systems in the Middle East and Afghanistan," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine procedures. "Sandstorms created by explosive devices, atmospheric disturbances caused by artillery bombardments, weather conditions that don't exist in any civilian manual or training program." Her explanation continued as she navigated through the eye of the storm with precision that seemed almost supernatural. When you survive impossible atmospheric conditions repeatedly, the extraordinary becomes routine. You learn to read air currents the way sailors read ocean currents, by understanding forces that most people never even know exist. "Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez," the radio crackled with amazement. "We're tracking your flight path on our radar systems. What you're doing right now is... This should be impossible. How are you keeping an aircraft of that size and weight stable while descending at 4,000 feet per minute?" "Applied physics, Commander," Arya replied while making micro-adjustments that kept their descent smooth despite conditions that should have made controlled flight impossible. Combined with 17 years of experience turning impossible situations into safe landings. Marcus Thompson watched through his window as they descended through the eye of the storm, lightning streaking across the walls of clouds around them like apocalyptic fireworks display. But somehow, incredibly, the aircraft remained stable and controlled, as if guided by forces that transcended normal human understanding of flight dynamics. Dr. Martinez monitored Captain Harrison's condition while observing Arya's flying with professional fascination. "Colonel, his vital signs are remaining stable despite the G-forces we're experiencing. Whatever you're doing, it's working perfectly." "General Hayes," Arya called over the radio while requesting final approach coordinates, requesting permission to land at Dover Air Force Base. "We'll need a runway with full emergency capability and complete medical personnel standing by for Captain Harrison." "Spectre, Dover is completely ready for your arrival," General Hayes responded immediately. "Main runway has been cleared and prepared with emergency foam. Ambulances and full medical teams are in position. You have absolute priority over all military and civilian air traffic." David shook his head in amazement as he watched Arya's hands move over the controls with fluid precision. "Colonel?" "When we touch down, and I now believe we actually will touch down safely, will you explain to me why they call you Spectre?" Arya allowed herself a barely perceptible smile, the first sign of personal satisfaction she had shown since assuming command of the aircraft. "Because, David, when other pilots see impossible situations, they see death approaching. When I see impossible situations, I see puzzles that can be solved with the right combination of skill, experience, and absolute refusal to accept defeat." Over the next 15 minutes, Marcus Thompson would witness a display of technical skill and personal courage that would completely redefine his understanding of competence, leadership, and the true meaning of heroism under pressure. As they approached Dover Air Force Base, Marcus realized he had insulted a living legend, and when they finally landed, he would discover that his prejudices had nearly prevented him from witnessing one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of commercial aviation. Marcus realized he had insulted a living legend whose story would make every prejudiced assumption he had ever made seem not just wrong, but dangerously, embarrassingly stupid. "Spectre, we have Dover Air Force Base in visual range," Commander Rodriguez announced over the radio. "Weather conditions at the base are still severe, but within acceptable parameters for emergency landing. You are cleared for immediate approach on runway 01. As they descended toward Dover, Aria began the most challenging phase of the entire emergency. Transitioning from storm navigation to precision landing in conditions that were still far from ideal. The runway appeared through the storm clouds like a beacon of salvation, but the approach would require every skill she had developed over 17 years of military aviation. "David, I need you to monitor our approach speed and altitude with absolute precision," she instructed, while beginning the complex calculations required for landing a Boeing 747 in crosswinds that were still gusting above safe parameters for commercial aviation. "All passengers, this is Colonel Washington," she announced over the intercom. "We are beginning our final approach to Dover Air Force Base. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and prepare for a landing that may involve some turbulence, but I can assure you that we will touch down safely." The authority and confidence in her voice had a calming effect that spread throughout the cabin. Even the most anxious passengers found themselves trusting in her competence, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Marcus Thompson gripped his armrests as he watched the approach through his window. The runway lights appeared and disappeared through the storm, and he could see military vehicles positioned along the edges of the landing strip. Emergency equipment that represented the full mobilization of Air Force resources for their arrival. "Colonel," Dr. Martinez called from her position monitoring Captain Harrison, "his condition remains stable, but I recommend we get him to emergency medical facilities as quickly as possible once we're on the ground." "Understood, Doctor," Aria replied, while making final approach adjustments that demonstrated her complete mastery of the aircraft under the most challenging conditions imaginable. "Dover Medical Team is standing by with full emergency capabilities." Victoria Thompson looked at her husband with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "Marcus, I hope you understand what just happened here. We could have died because of your arrogance and prejudice. This woman saved our lives despite the way you treated her." Marcus couldn't respond. He was watching Aria's final approach maneuvers with the growing realization that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just exceptional piloting skills, but a level of professional competence that transcended anything he had encountered in his business career. "Spectre, this is General Hayes," the radio crackled with admiration. "Your approach trajectory is textbook perfect under these conditions. Dover Ground Control reports that your landing approach is being recorded for training purposes at the Air Force Academy." The wheels touched down with surprisingly gentle contact, despite the severe crosswinds and storm conditions. The landing was so smooth that many passengers didn't even realize they had touched ground until they heard the engines reversing thrust and felt the aircraft decelerating on the runway. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dover Air Force Base," Aria announced with quiet satisfaction. "We have landed safely, and emergency medical personnel are approaching the aircraft now to assist Captain Harrison." As the aircraft came to a complete stop, the cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers who had been terrified just minutes earlier were now clapping with genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed, a display of skill and courage that had literally saved their lives. David Wilson turned to Aria with tears in his eyes. "Colonel, I will never forget what you did today. You didn't just save our lives. You showed me what real leadership looks like under impossible pressure." Dr. Martinez stood up and addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just experienced was not routine emergency procedures. What Colonel Washington accomplished today will be studied by aviation experts and military academies for years to come." Marcus Thompson finally found his voice. but the words came out as barely a whisper. "Colonel Washington, I owe you the most profound apology of my life. Everything I said was wrong, and I understand now that my prejudices nearly prevented me from recognizing the most qualified person on this aircraft." Aria began shutting down the aircraft systems with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the emergency. "Mr. Thompson, we can discuss this later. Right now, let's focus on getting everyone safely off this aircraft and getting Captain Harrison the medical attention he needs." Outside, military vehicles surrounded the aircraft, and medical personnel were already boarding to assist with Captain Harrison's condition. The storm was beginning to subside, but the impact of what had occurred would resonate far beyond this single flight. What none of the passengers yet knew was that this landing would change not only their individual lives, but also civil aviation policies, emergency protocols, and the way the entire world would understand what exceptional people can achieve when others underestimate them. 6 months after the miraculous landing at Dover Air Force Base, Colonel Aria Washington stood at attention in the Pentagon's most prestigious ceremony room, surrounded by the highest-ranking military officials in the United States Armed Forces. "Colonel Washington," announced Secretary of Defense Robert Chen, "for extraordinary heroism and exceptional skill demonstrated during the civilian aircraft emergency of Flight 447, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, making you the youngest black woman in history to achieve this rank." The ceremony was attended by representatives from multiple branches of the military, civilian aviation authorities, and international observers who had come to witness the recognition of what experts were calling one of the most remarkable displays of piloting skill in aviation history. General Washington saved not only 312 lives that day, the Secretary continued during his speech, but she redefined how we evaluate competence versus appearance in our armed forces. Her actions have led to comprehensive policy changes in both military and civilian aviation training programs. In the audience, Dr. Patricia Martinez applauded enthusiastically. She had co-authored a groundbreaking article with Aria on emergency aviation medicine that was published in the world's most prestigious medical journal, establishing new protocols for medical emergencies during extreme flight conditions. David Wilson, now promoted to captain and commanding his own commercial aircraft, sat in the front row wearing his dress uniform. He had requested permission to attend the ceremony, and he never missed an opportunity to credit Aria as the greatest inspiration of his aviation career. "Every time I face challenging weather conditions," he would later tell aviation magazines, "I remember Colonel Washington's words about turning impossible situations into puzzles that can be solved with skill and experience." The storm navigation technique that Aria had pioneered during the emergency had been incorporated into military training manuals worldwide. 3 major universities had offered endowed chairs in her name, and the Federal Aviation Administration had created new emergency protocols based on her innovative approaches. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson faced a very different reality as the consequences of his prejudiced behavior during the emergency continued to unfold with devastating precision. The video footage of his discriminatory comments during the flight emergency had leaked on social media, going viral with over 50 million views worldwide. The footage showed his dismissive attitude toward Aria, his questioning of her qualifications based on appearance, and his insistence that someone of her background couldn't possibly be qualified to handle an aviation emergency. Thompson Investment Holdings, his real estate development firm, lost 80% of its clients within 3 months of the video's release. Major corporate clients terminated contracts, citing concerns about working with someone whose prejudices had been so publicly displayed during a life-and-death situation. How can we trust business decisions to someone whose judgment is so compromised by racial bias? Asked Margaret Foster, CEO of Foster Development Corporation, when she announced the termination of a $50 million joint venture. Marcus was forced to file for personal bankruptcy after 18 months, selling his Manhattan penthouse, his vacation homes, and most of his luxury possessions to cover debts and legal fees from terminated contracts. "Daddy, why do people get angry when they see your name on Google?" asked his 12-year-old daughter Emma during one of their increasingly rare visits innocently delivering words that destroyed what remained of his pride and self-image. Victoria Thompson had filed for divorce, taking half of the remaining assets and securing full custody of their children. "I married a man who I thought admired success and achievement," she told the divorce court judge. "I discovered that I had lived for 15 years with someone who confuses privilege with competence and mistakes prejudice for insight." Marcus now worked as a salesman at Thompson Used Cars. Ironically, a dealership that shared his family name, but was owned by distant relatives who had agreed to employ him only after extensive family pressure and his public commitment to sensitivity training. He used public transportation to get to work every morning, riding the same buses and trains with the ordinary people he had once dismissed as beneath his consideration. Every morning, he passed a giant billboard in the city center that showed Aria in her Air Force uniform with the words, "Leadership has no color. Excellence has no prejudice." During a lecture at the Air Force Academy, Aria was asked by a cadet how to deal with prejudice and discrimination during military service. "Young man," she replied with the wisdom earned through years of breaking barriers, "let them underestimate you. While they spend their energy doubting your abilities, you use that same energy to develop skills they can never question or diminish." Her response became one of the most quoted pieces of advice in military leadership training, inspiring an entire generation of young service members from minority backgrounds to turn discrimination into motivation. The transformation of both lives, one rising to unprecedented heights, the other falling from privilege to consequence, would become a case study in how prejudice ultimately destroys those who practice it. Aria Washington's story continued to inspire transformation far beyond the military community. Her autobiography, Flying Through the Storm, Leadership Beyond Prejudice, became a bestseller within weeks of publication, with all proceeds directed toward aviation scholarships for underrepresented minorities. The Aria Washington Foundation, established with proceeds from her book and speaking engagements, had already provided full aviation training scholarships to over 200 young people who had been told they didn't belong in cockpits because of their race, gender, or economic background. "Every person I save, every pilot I train, every barrier I break," Aria said during her keynote address at the National Aviation Conference, "exists because people like Mr. Thompson remind me why this work matters. Their prejudice becomes fuel for our progress." Major airlines began implementing new hiring and training protocols based on Aria's recommendations, focusing on competence and merit rather than assumptions based on appearance or background. The Washington protocols became standard procedure for evaluating pilot qualifications across the industry. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson's fall from grace continued with relentless precision. His former business associates avoided him at industry events. His country club membership had been revoked, and his children had begun using their mother's maiden name to avoid the stigma associated with his public disgrace. 3 years after the flight emergency, Marcus encountered Aria at Reagan National Airport. She was wearing her Air Force dress uniform, surrounded by aides and security personnel, as she traveled to another speaking engagement about leadership and overcoming adversity. Marcus was wearing his blue dealership uniform, carrying a small, inexpensive suitcase as he prepared for a budget flight to visit his children, a visit that Victoria's lawyers had limited to supervised meetings every other weekend. "General Washington," he said quietly, approaching her with the humility of someone whose world had completely collapsed, "I would like to properly apologize for what happened on that flight. I know words can't undo the damage I caused, but I need you to know that I understand how wrong I was." Aria studied him for a moment, seeing not the arrogant businessman from 3 years earlier, but someone who had been fundamentally broken by his own ignorance and the consequences of his prejudices. "Mr. Thompson," she replied with a gentleness that surprised him, "you actually gave me the greatest gift possible that day, though I'm sure that wasn't your intention." Marcus looked confused. "How could I possibly have given you anything positive? I was horrible to you. I questioned your qualifications based on nothing but prejudice and ignorance. You reminded me exactly why I do what I do," Aria explained. "Every person I save, every pilot I mentor, every barrier I break down, all of it is possible because people like you exist to motivate those of us who refuse to be limited by other people's assumptions. She continued with words that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Your prejudice didn't diminish me. It revealed you. Every time someone underestimates my capabilities because of my race or gender, they give me an advantage they don't even realize they're providing. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. I lost everything because of my prejudices. My business, my family, my reputation, all of it destroyed because I couldn't see past my own assumptions. No, sir. Gautier corrected him with surprising gentleness. You didn't lose everything because of your prejudices. You discovered that you never had anything real to lose in the first place. Her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Privilege is not achievement, Mr. Thompson. Respect cannot be inherited or purchased. Competence has nothing to do with appearance or social status. As she walked away with her security team, Marcus realized he was experiencing the hardest lesson of his life. The woman he had judged incapable of flying a commercial aircraft now commanded entire squadrons and influenced aviation policy at the highest levels of government. While he, who had considered himself superior based on wealth and social position, could barely command respect from his own children or maintain stable employment at a used car dealership. The most devastating revenge, Arya had said in her last television interview, isn't destroying your enemies, it's building a legacy so brilliant that their pettiness becomes irrelevant. Marcus understood now that Arya's true victory wasn't in proving him wrong, it was in making his opinions meaningless through the sheer force of her achievements and the positive impact she continued to have on the world. As she had said in that same interview, while they spend time underestimating us, we spend that time becoming unforgettable. Standing alone in the busy airport terminal, Marcus finally understood that the greatest tragedy wasn't what he had lost, but what he had prevented himself from recognizing until it was far too late to matter. 5 years after the emergency landing that changed both their lives forever, Arya Washington had become more than just a military hero. She had evolved into a symbol of excellence, triumphing over prejudice, inspiring countless individuals who had been underestimated because of their appearance, background, or circumstances. General Washington now served as Director of Advanced Aviation Training at the Pentagon, overseeing programs that had revolutionized how military and civilian pilots were trained for emergency situations. Her innovations had been adopted by air forces in 17 countries, and her emergency protocols had already saved over 1,000 lives in similar crisis situations worldwide. The Spectre technique, her method for navigating through extreme weather using three-dimensional atmospheric analysis, was now taught at every major aviation academy on Earth. Military historians were already calling her one of the most influential figures in modern aviation history. What happened on that flight, she explained during her final interview for this story, wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about demonstrating that excellence exists everywhere, even in places where prejudice tells us not to look. Her foundation had grown into a global organization, providing aviation training to underrepresented communities in 47 countries. Over 3,000 pilots, who might never have had opportunities because of discrimination, were now flying for major airlines, military forces, and emergency services worldwide. Marcus Thompson, meanwhile, had experienced a different kind of transformation through the complete collapse of his previous life. The humiliation and financial ruin had forced him to confront the depth of his prejudices and their consequences in ways that no sensitivity training or corporate workshop ever could have achieved. He had spent the last 2 years working with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how prejudice ultimately destroys those who practice it. His presentations to corporate executives and hiring managers had become surprisingly effective, precisely because his fall from privilege was so complete and undeniable. I lost everything, he would tell audiences, not because I was unlucky, but because I let prejudice blind me to excellence that was sitting right in front of me. I judged someone's capabilities based on their appearance and nearly got everyone on that plane killed because of my ignorance. His children, now in high school, had slowly begun rebuilding a relationship with him as they witnessed his genuine efforts to understand and make amends for his past behavior. The process was painful and slow, but it was real in ways his previous life had never been. My father used to be someone who thought money made him smart, his daughter Emma said during a school presentation about overcoming prejudice. Now he's someone who understands that being wrong taught him more than being wealthy ever did. Victoria Thompson had remarried, ironically, to Dr. James Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon who had grown up in poverty before earning his medical degree through merit scholarships. Their wedding had been covered by diversity-focused publications as an example of how people can choose to build relationships based on character rather than assumptions. As for the other passengers from Flight 447, many had stayed in touch with Aria over the years. They had formed an informal network of people whose lives had been forever changed by witnessing what happened when prejudice met undeniable competence. Dr. Patricia Martinez continued her collaboration with Aria, and together they had established new medical protocols for aviation emergencies that were being implemented globally. Their partnership had become a model for interdisciplinary cooperation between military and civilian expertise. David Wilson, now a senior captain with international roots, never failed to credit Aria when he spoke to young pilots about handling emergency situations. "She didn't just save our lives," he would say. "She showed us what leadership actually looks like when everything depends on your decisions." In her final public statement about the incident, Aria Washington offered words that would be remembered long after the specific details of the emergency were forgotten. Excellence doesn't ask permission to exist. Competence doesn't require validation from people who mistake privilege for qualification. When you know who you are and what you're capable of, other people's prejudices become irrelevant to your success. She concluded with advice that had inspired millions. The most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger, it's achievement. While they're questioning whether you belong, you keep proving that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. CTA Final. Thank you to everyone who typed courage and shared your locations with us. Seeing this global community united for accountability and truth proves that competence is a universal human value. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more stories of unsung heroes triumphing over prejudice. Until next time, remember that excellence speaks louder than assumptions, and the greatest victory over discrimination is simply being undeniably excellent at what you do. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later realized they had made the biggest mistake of their life? Share your story of overcoming adversity in the comments below. And let's build a community where excellence is recognized regardless of where it comes from.